Hi, Isabel here, instructor at 22 North Bay. Today's tutorial is about the deadlift. I'll go over some key points for proper technique in the deadlift and how to avoid and fix common mistakes. Most of the demos will be done using a barbell because the eventual goal would be to maximize strength. However, I know that most people probably don't have a barbell at home, so I will also show the technique using different equipment that you may have at home, as well as accessory exercises. I hope this tutorial will also be useful to you in the future, whenever we come back to the gym and we can lift some heavy stuff again.
First, let's look at the proper movement pattern of the deadlift. Standing straight, place your hands on your thighs, and then start hinging at the hips, sliding your hands down your thighs until you get to your knee level. From there, lower your shoulders and hips at the same time as you bend the knees until you get to about mid-shin, because that would be the starting position of the barbell. As you do that, your back should still be straight. From there, reverse the movement. So imagine you're doing a leg press towards the ground. So press towards the ground as you lift your shoulders and hips at the same time. Once you get to your knees, extend your hips back to the starting position. And this is the proper movement pattern of the deadlift. You can practice this for several times without any equipment, and it's a great way to get this pattern drilled in before you start your deadlifts. A proper setup is very important to make sure you maintain safe technique and are able to generate as much force as possible and move the weight as efficiently as possible. Step number 1, walk up to the barbell and position yourself so that the barbell is right over the middle of your foot. This will vary slightly from one person to the other, but it's usually about 1 inch from your shins. Now bend over, place your hands on the barbell just outside your hips, about shoulder width distance. Do not roll the barbell towards you. Now, without moving the barbell, bring your shins towards the barbell. It shouldn't be much, since you should be only about 1 inch away from the barbell. Your hips should now be set at the right height. The next step is to flatten your back, engaging the posterior chain. Think about squeezing your chest out. I will show you those 4 steps of the setup again, using a front view this time. The technique I am demonstrating is for the conventional deadlift. Notice my feet are about hip-width distance and my toes pointing forward. I will not go over the sumo technique because this would be a very long video. Another important point is to keep your neck neutral. So don't look up because this is going to hyperextend your neck. Instead, look down about 1 meter in front of you and try to keep your neck in line with your spine throughout the movement. Now, in terms of stance for the conventional, I personally like to deadlift with a pretty narrow stance with my toes pointing forward. But if you're someone who tends to have a hard time keeping your back flat, meaning your hamstrings are probably pretty tight, you may benefit from turning your toes out slightly and pressing your knees against your forearms, just like I'm demonstrating here. I've seen several strong men use this stance and deadlift over 1,000 pounds, so definitely something to try out, see if it feels right for you. Now a little bit about the grip. There are 3 different types of grip for the deadlift. One is called the overhand grip, and this is simply wrapping your hands around the bar, palms facing back. This is the best grip to work on your grip strength. However, you may not be able to lift heavy weight using this grip. Another type is called the hook grip. In this one, you are wrapping your index and middle finger on top of your thumb. This grip is used in Olympic lifting, but it can also be used to lift heavier weight as it locks the bar in place. However, it can be quite uncomfortable if you're not used to it. The last type is the mixed grip, with one hand facing back and one hand facing forward. This is great to lift heavy weight as you are exerting force in opposite directions, so the bar is less likely to slip out of your hands. However, there is a greater risk of bicep tear in the arm facing forward, so make sure you keep your arms fully straight. I also strongly recommend that you alternate your grip, either in between each rep or in between each set, so you develop strength evenly. The optimal back angle at setup may vary from one person to the other, and this will depend on your anatomy. More specifically, the length of your legs relative to the length of your torso, and also the length of your arms. So just for fun, I decided to do a little experiment. In this first clip, I'm showing you my natural back angle at setup. Here I stepped up on 2 plates to simulate as if I had very long legs and a shorter torso. And if you notice, I have to bring my hips slightly lower in order to be able to properly engage my posterior chain. Then I placed the barbell up on 2 plates instead, in order to simulate as if I had a longer torso relative to the length of my legs. And if you notice, I have to keep my hips slightly higher in order to get into the proper position. So the back angle will vary depending on your anatomy, and it's nothing to be worried about. There's no perfect back angle. As long as you follow those 4 setup points that I outlined at the beginning, you should be good to go. In order to build a strong deadlift, you must absolutely hinge at the hips, keep your posterior chain engaged throughout the movement, and load the hamstrings. If you fail any of these components, not only are you at greater risk of injury, but you will not be able to generate your full strength potential. If you're unsure if you're hinging at the hips properly, you can practice the pattern using a dowel or a broomstick. Place the broomstick along your spine. It should be in contact with your head as well as your tailbone, holding it with one hand at your neck level, palm facing your neck, and one hand at your low back level, palm facing away from you. And then practice hinging at the hips, making sure that the broomstick stays in contact with your head and your tailbone throughout the movement. If you have a hard time engaging your posterior chain and flattening your back, a good way to activate your posterior chain, especially the lats, and be aware of how this activation should feel throughout the deadlift, is the banded deadlift that you can do with a resistance band and a broomstick. If you don't have a resistance band at home, you can use a bungee cord that most people have in their garage, or there are other options in home improvement stores, I'm sure. And you can wrap the elastic band that you're using around a post that is stable, that you're sure is not going to move, and then wrap it around your dowel and step away enough so that you feel the tension, but it's not dragging you forward too much. And once you have enough resistance, then practice the pattern of the deadlift, making sure that you're able to keep the dowel as close to your body as possible, and you should feel a great activation in your lats and posterior chain. Another great exercise that you can do with your resistance band or your bungee cord is the straight arm lat pull down. So attach your elastic to a stable post, and then hinge at the hips, bending your knees slightly, keeping your back straight. From there, pull the elastic down to your knees, keeping the arms fully straight as you do that, and you should feel your lats engage. And try to keep a shoulder-width grip to simulate the deadlift. Finally, a great way to practice loading the hamstrings and also develop better mobility for the deadlift is the Romanian deadlift. This is basically a deadlift, but starting at the top of the movement instead of the bottom. If you're pretty new at the deadlift, I recommend that you use very light weight, so no more than an empty bar. Starting at the top of the movement, hips fully extended, you're going to start by hinging at the hips, like we practiced with the broomstick, keeping your lats engaged and your back flat throughout the movement, and feel the tension increase in your hamstrings as you lower down. However, only go as low as you're able to maintain your back straight. So if you feel your back rounding at any point, go back up a few inches and this will be your lowest point. Even if the load is light, so that it's not dangerous to round your back, you do not want to reinforce a bad motor pattern. There are many issues that may come up with the deadlift, and obviously I won't have time to go over them all. But two very common ones are due to your hamstrings or glutes or both being either very tight or weak relative to other muscles. If you have a very hard time strengthening your back when sitting up for the deadlift, that could be due to tight hamstrings or glutes. I find that the best way to improve your mobility specifically for the deadlift is to practice the Romanian deadlift like I just showed, making sure that you keep the weight relatively light and that you stop at the point where your back starts rounding. It's also a good idea to do some static stretches for the hamstrings, where you're holding the stretch for at least 30 seconds. So here's an example. Just make sure that you're hinging at the hips, so think about bringing your belly towards your thigh and not just trying to go as far as possible and letting your back round and your pelvis tuck under, because this is obviously counterproductive. If you're able to sit up properly, but your back starts rounding right away as soon as you start lifting the barbell, this is likely due to weak hamstrings. Yes, I did sacrifice my back for the purpose of this video. No, don't worry, my back is fine. I knew it wasn't too much of a risk with light weight. But do not try this at home. If this is you, this means that you are probably trying to lift more than what your hamstrings can handle. If you want to avoid a back injury or even a torn hamstring, please put the ego at the door and take off some weights. The Romanian deadlift is also a great way to strengthen the hamstrings, but again, be careful with the weights and only add more weight if you're able to maintain proper technique. Now, this is all good, but obviously now that everyone's at home, you may not have access to a barbell, but you can still practice some of the accessory movements that I showed at the beginning using a broomstick. And you can also find some things in your home that you can use for deadlifts. You will not be able to maximize your strength without a barbell, but you can still improve your strength and improve your technique on the deadlift. So I'll show you some examples of how the technique can be modified depending on the size of the object that you're using. If you're using a single object, I'm using a kettlebell here for demo. You want to position yourself so that your midfoot is in line with the center of mass of the object. So it's the same principle as the barbell deadlift. The handle or whatever you're using to pull from should therefore be about an inch away from your shins. The rest is the same setup as the barbell deadlift, but your back angle and your stance may vary depending on the height and width of the object. If you decide to use two objects to increase load, you can either place them side by side and use a wider stance. But if the objects are too large to place between your legs or too low and you cannot reach down with proper form, then it is better to perform a suitcase style deadlift where the objects are outside your feet using a more narrow stance, and so that you can bend your knees more, keeping a good posture. So this is all I have for you today. I tried to cram in as much information as possible in as little time as possible. So I hope you could find some useful tips. And this whole video, you certainly noticed that I was lifting in socks. This is a personal preference for me for deadlifts because most shoes do not have a perfectly straight sole. And so this makes you more unstable, which is obviously not ideal if you're trying to lift heavy weight off the ground. And also lifting in socks lowers your center of gravity, and this makes you more mechanically efficient.